Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today, those who are joining us on Zoom or on Facebook Live, for joining us today on this conversation about bridges. I'm Catherine Orsborn, the Executive Director of Shoulder to Shoulder, and we at Shoulder to Shoulder really wanted to host this important conversation before the year comes to a close, because we think it's such a critical question to grapple with as we head into 2021. I don't think anyone really needs reminding about why this conversation is so important right now, but for the sake of setting the stage, we're living in the midst of a pandemic. We're just on the other side of a highly charged election season, and our country continues to reel from longstanding racism and injustice that has come into greater focus for many people this year. We're living in a country that is incredibly polarized, and so many people are hurting for so many reasons. We are also living in a country of people working so hard to care for others and to further justice, equity, and healing in our society. So many people over the past several months have been calling for healing in this country, for bridging divides, for coming together as a nation. And others have challenged this call in a variety of ways. And that's what we're here to discuss today. How do we think about the work that's ahead of us in 2021 as a people who want to see an America that values all who call this country home? So here to offer their perspectives on this topic today, we have Samar Ali and Wajahat Ali. No relation to each other, I don't believe. Samar is the president and CEO of Millions of Conversations, which transcends divides by bringing people together around common values for a shared future. Wajahat is a New York Times contributing op-ed writer, a public speaker, a recovering attorney, and a tired dad of 3 cute kids. And I encourage you to read their very impressive full bios if you haven't gotten a chance to already. But thank you, Waj and Samar, both for being part of this conversation today. So I want to kick us off with a question about polarization. So we talk a lot about polarization in this country, and I'm curious to hear from each of you if you think this is the most helpful framework for thinking about this. Do we want to reduce polarization, or do we want to reduce harm, or is there a different way that we should be sort of thinking about this question? How do you think about this framework in general as we enter this conversation? Samar, start us off.
Sure. Well, I think that if there's there should be no doubt at this point that the country's polarized. I think the answer is what do we do about that polarization? And about the framing of it, I think there are multiple frames that we should consider. And the country's polarized, we're divided. What does that mean? Why are we divided? Why are we polarized? And so the framing of that is where I think the meat of this discussion is going to go. And we have to think about, do we want to go beyond the limits of division? And I mean, how do we go beyond these limits of division? And that's what we mean by transcending as well. And so sometimes people say, well, we're polarized because of race. Some people will say, well, we're polarized because of partisan politics. Others will say we're polarized because of geography in terms of rural versus urban. We're polarized because of a scarcity mentality. And I think in many ways, what we're going to see is that there's an intersectionality between all of those things, and they all contribute to the reasons that we're polarized. And then I think we have to think very clearly about, well, does that polarization serve our interests as a community? And if the answer is no, and I would argue that polarization for the sake of polarization is not healthy for the community, then we do need to figure out what to do about polarization and find a way forward in a way that allows for us all to be our whole self.
So yeah, I would say, judging off what Samar said, then I would say we have to also question the limits of unity as the complement to that, right? Because many people say, oh, we have to unify as the United States of America, out of many one, let's bridge the divides, let's build bridges, which is a noble endeavor, and I wholeheartedly support, which is why I'm here for Shoulder to Shoulder. You guys are doing fantastic work. But the polarization has always existed in America. We had a Revolutionary War. We had the most bloody war, which was the Civil War. After the Civil War, we had segregation, we had Jim Crow, we had lynchings, right? And so there have been many of us who have not been part of the American narrative. There have been many of us who have been excised. There have been many of us who have been stomped out. We have many of us who have tried desperately to become a co-protagonist of this thing called the United States of America. But oftentimes, because we're not the ethnic group, we're not from the same zip code, we're not the right religion, right? We have had to fight and claw our way towards this United States of America, to be seen as an American, right? And I'll give you an example. I've been in this country my entire life, was born and raised here. The worst thing I used to get called in the 80s and 90s was Gandhi, which is actually a compliment. Now, in 2020, the amount of, I've always gotten a lot of colorful mail, and I'm sure Samar has as well, being Muslim, Pakistani, she's Arab and Muslim. We get a very colorful emails and messages. I have never received the amount of open vitriolic email and hate that I've received in 2020, where people literally say, go back to where you came from. And I always say, Fremont, California? I would love to. Can you pay the rent? Because I got maxed out. And so I think we're at this station right now where we've always been polarized, but the question is America has always had to work towards progress. And if you look at social progress, racial progress, gender progress, right, LGBTQ progress, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back throughout the beginning of US history until now. And so the limits of unity, just as a compliment to what Samar said, is we can sit there and say, let's all get together, we all raise our children, we all watch Netflix, and we all have a great recipe for apple pie, and I like hummus, and you like hummus, and who doesn't like hummus? Let's all eat hummus. But I think the next step forward in this perilous time is, how can we push and stretch this country to accommodate the rest of us? And that means, and I'll end it on this, uncomfortable conversations. That means stepping on toes. And then what also this means, and I'm not trying to end on a dark note, but just as a realistic student of history, that means some people will get left behind. And the quick analogy I'll give is 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, Supreme Court case that said segregation was illegal. Go back and look at the photos and videos of, say, 1957, Little Rock 9, where those little young Black girls wanted just to go to school. Look at the faces of the folks there, young white women, a lot of the young white men who were spitting at them, cursing at them. The National Guard had to come out because young Black girls just wanted to go to school. Those guys went to church, they ate apple pie, they were nice. Some of those people, through time, they look back and said, I'm so ashamed, I've changed. Some of those people never changed. And I think the test for us now is, do we want to move forward towards progress? What does that progress look like? And are we comfortable with the fact that we'll get most of us, but we won't get some of us? And how do we negotiate those spaces? Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that, actually, lots of good food for thought. And I think we're saying in many ways the same thing.
Of course.
And I think one thing I would just say is, we have always had a polarization issue in America, but I do think it's about degrees. And it's the degrees of the polarization. And we're at a crossroads demographically, in that we are becoming a majority minority country. And that's the first time in America's history. We've kicked the can down the road a lot. Arguably, we never should have. And it definitely has gone on for too long in terms of actually having a truth and reconciliation process in this country, of where we reconcile with parts of our past which have been absolutely brutal and barbaric. And how do we do that and live up to the values and the principles that we have decided are quintessential values and principles in 21st century America? While also at the same time celebrating that we have had successes in our past and in our history that we should be proud of. There is an American identity that binds us together. There is an American experience that binds us together. There are American values that go beyond we celebrate Thanksgiving. We have an apple pie recipe that we like to share. We both like to eat hummus. We are capable of actually having substantive conversations that move us forward in a way that connects us and reminds us of our commonly shared values and our humanity, and that are uncomfortable as well. And we often say at Millions of Conversations, like, we're here to encourage people to get comfortable with the uncomfortable. And I would just say that in my own experience, and I should note that I'm speaking to you right now from the state of Tennessee, my home state. I was born and raised here. I grew up in a rural county, Humphreys County, in a city called Waverly in Tennessee that's down the road from where I live right now, Nashville, Tennessee. And I would say that I have watched the divide and the polarization in this country get further and further and further apart. We're getting further and further and further apart. And about with regards to this mail, I would also just say that just personally, and as you're right to note this, Waj, it has gotten worse with time. And I remember the first time that I actually got hate mail. It was the winter of 2002. I was student body president at Vanderbilt University, and I helped co-write a resolution to change a dormitory on campus from Confederate Memorial Hall to Memorial Hall. This was almost 20 years ago. And I was depicted as the devil. I received hate mail that was so alarming that there was security that was placed on my dormitory at the time. And it's gotten worse. And from this different from observing this and being a part of this historic moment, which we all are, I've come to this conclusion that we have to get comfortable with the uncomfortable. We have to figure out a way to move forward that's rooted in our values and in our common humanity.
Thanks to you both. And I mean, one of the things that sort of prompted this particular conversation was that Waj, you wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that got a lot of traction over the last several weeks, and it was around the work that you have done to engage Trump voters in particular, and you know that you feel it hasn't worked. And I want to just ask, I mean, you have a complicated history with bridge building in the sense that you've done a lot of work. You wrote co-authored the Fear Inc. report, really encouraging bridge building and outreach. You've been involved in a number of different sort of bridge building efforts over time, and I'm curious to hear from you. And I know Samar, you all have kind of overlapped in some of these spaces as well. How your views have shifted on that, and kind of where you stand now on the role of reaching people. You know, I mean, you're saying that there are some people who are just unreachable, but what about those people who perhaps are less easily reachable, but who you know, people like I'm thinking of in particular a Muslim man who's part of the Shoulder to Shoulder community membership network who read your op-ed and lives in a rural area of Wisconsin, where he, you know, he's like, these are my neighbors. What am I supposed to do with this? And so just kind of like thinking about both that question around how this has shifted for you over time, but also, you know, what does that mean for people who are living in communities that are in their own very community divided?
I'll let Samar answer that last part because she's literally living through it, and I'll give you my commentary. Look, I was born and raised in the Bay Area. I'm the beneficiary of a very diverse ecosystem, where I was oftentimes the token Muslim and the token Pakistani. And I must have given like 14 speeches on Islam, the Prophet Muhammad, Muhammad Ali, Bollywood, like literally everything you can imagine, like drop of the dime, Wajahat Ali, be the token Muslim, be the cultural ambassador of 1400 years of civilization, go for it. I went to an all boys Jesuit Catholic high school. I knew it was all boys Jesuit Catholic high school. I got the highest grades in the all boys Jesuit Catholic high school. I read the Bible for the first time as a practicing Muslim. And because of the shared stories and the shared prophets and the shared values, I was like, oh, this is amazing. This is what I learned at home. And I just crushed it. And you can imagine Father Allender used to read the highest grades every semester, and the highest grade was Muslim Wajahat Ali, and his Jesuit heart used to just crack a little bit. And the second highest grade was a Hindu, and the third highest grade was Naveed Mustafavi, a lapsed Persian Muslim. But there, you know, there's something really powerful about that. Matt, I could still drop an Our Father. If anyone wants to do an Our Father, I got it. And these were my friends, people who didn't look like me. I was their first Muslim friend. They knew I fasted. And so I have experienced literally being the stranger, the ajnabi in like, you know, the homeland, being both us and them. And I've that my whole life, and I think Samar and I, by virtue of our identity, our religion, our ethnicity, have had to play that role. So I'm really good at playing that role. The door is always open, like I said in the New York Times article. The door is always going to be open. My hand is always going to be stretched out across the aisle. But after 20 years, especially after the war on terror, 9/11, Muslims in particular have been asked, where are the moderate Muslims? How come you guys haven't condemned terrorism? Show me the moderate Muslim. Engage in the condemn-a-thon. Samar and Wajahat, there is a violent Muslim extremist you've never met in a country you've never visited. You apologize for that person. And until then, and until I feel comfortable, I'm going to hold your loyalty and your patriotism suspect. And not only your loyalty and patriotism suspect, all of the people who look Muslim-y like you. And so that's been our life in the past 20 years, right? And so I've never been defensive. I've always tried to explain who I am, try to be proactive, try to reach out. Not 2016 election happens. We are told, and I knew this was wrong because I covered it, it's economic anxiety that was the primary motivator. I said it isn't economic anxiety, it's cultural anxiety. Every single major study that's come out in the past 4 years, I said it's primarily cultural anxiety that has driven many Obama white voters to Trump. I said, fine. I told my speaking agency, send me to the Rust Belt. Send me to Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, just send me to all these places. I'm going to give my spiel. This is my narrative. This is my story. This is who I am. This is my vision of America. This is the history of how other communities who once weren't considered white were treated. The Irish, the Jews, the Catholics, the Russians, and tag you're it, now the Muslims, right? And I said, listen, you need me to suffer in order to feel great again. I want you to have healthcare. I want your children to succeed. I want you to have good Wi-Fi internet. I want the Rust Belt to be elevated. I want success for everybody. I just want a seat at the table. Whereas if I'm at the table, you think I'm replacing you. And I tried to be very honest, and I listened and I empathized. But it came to a point, 2018 midterm elections. If you guys remember, Donald Trump was riding high on job growth, on a bullish economy. There was only one talking point that Trump and Republicans ran on for the 2018 midterm elections. Does anyone remember? Caravan, invasion, rapists, criminals. And then there was a shift from 2018, 2019. And I realized my outreach to certain Trump supporters was me essentially trying to defend my humanity. Me literally saying, here's the case for you to treat me like an equal. And after a while, I'm like, this is exhausting. Instead, what I'm going to invest in is building the multicultural coalition of the willing, which includes Republicans, conservatives, some Trump voters, but people are at least open. And I think what Samar was saying about the polarization, this one aspect I'll tell you, which is a new aspect that is going to be a generational problem for us, is disinformation. In the last 4 years in particular, disinformation, social media disinformation, WhatsApp, and in particular the right-wing media ecosystem has become so extreme that many of our fellow Americans who do not have horns on their head, who are not evil, who eat their apple pie, who go to church, literally believe, and I'm using literally the word with the way the word is supposed to be used, believe that you, me, and Samar are part of the deep state conspiracy that is not only stealing children for sexual gratification, but we're eating children. And COVID is a hoax, and the vaccine is created by Bill Gates and the Jews to implement mind control. That is going to be a generational problem. And so sometimes you look at your limited time. I'll end on this. You look at limited time, limited effort, limited talents. And what I said is this, and this goes to the Muslim man in the rural community. And when I went to the Rust Belt, a lot of the Muslims came up to me and said, yo, bro, I don't live in New York. Like, I can't keep it real all the time. I have neighbors. I'm like the only Muslim. I'm the token brown guy. I'm the token Arab. I'm like, I feel you. I was once that guy. You do what you can. If all you can do is eat hummus, if literally is all you guys have right now is, I like hummus. You like hummus. Can we eat hummus? I'm like, if that's all you have right now to build a conversation or to transcend these limitations, Bismillah, do it. For me, in this role that I have, in this capacity, I have realized this is my best investment. Every single person has unique challenges and unique talents. And I'm not in the rural community like Samar is. She's there, man. She's lived it. And her neighbors are literally like Trump supporters. My neighbor here is a Trump supporter. I always wave to him. I'm nice to him, but it's a little bit different. It's more diverse. So I say you do what you can. And I'll go back to my first point is I feel that we have to test the limits of unity as well, because we have to deal with progress, with income inequality, racism, white supremacy, climate change, and disinformation. And there's so much at stake, literally fascism versus democracy. So some of us got to push and expand. Some of us got to maintain. Some of us got to do the hummus. Some of us got to be the disruptors. I hope I was able to answer your question.
So lots to say there and unpack. Those were a lot of different themes in one. And I would just say, let me just start with this. This is where the difficult conversations happen. And that we're not just talking about apple pie recipes and hummus and what food similarities we have. We are building community together. And so we're talking about how 1 in 6 Tennesseans, for example, goes to bed hungry every night, and what we're going to do about that. We're talking about the fear that people have in the public school system not providing the education that their children need. We're talking about the middle class narrowing and the economic inequality problems plaguing the community. We're also talking about what we do with a racist past. We also talk about the ramifications of a Jim Crow system, that we're in a post-Jim Crow state, but the ramifications of the institutionalization of racism for over 400 years in the country, the impact that that has had on a multitude of levels, including our criminal justice system. We're talking about a number of different issues here and trying to figure out a way forward in the midst and in the middle of, as Waj said, the fourth industrial revolution, which is this age of technology, which includes social media, which includes the manipulation of facts and narratives, and has created and birthed this post-truth political era that we're in right now. And the demonization narrative. And the demonization narrative, which is not a new one, but is now happening at warp speed because of social media, because of this disinformation era. And I just want to talk about that for just 1 second, because it didn't start this year. It didn't start in 2016. It arguably started over a decade ago. Waj and I actually first met when he was studying this. He did the research behind the Fear Inc. report. And I remembered, because I was one of the targets, one of the early targets of a disinformation campaign, of where I was coined the financial jihadist. People were told to fear me, and they're still told to fear me. I've been called a terrorist so many different times. These disinformation campaigns have targeted me. And Waj was studying about a decade ago the financial mechanisms and the people behind those disinformation campaigns, because they didn't just happen, they were orchestrated. And I realized then and there that I was a target, and that I'm not the only target. Now, there are communities that have been targeted. There are communities that are being demonized. There are communities that are being labeled. And those demonizing labels are leading to anger. They're actually building on animosity against the other, which is creating fear. That fear is leading to blame. As Waj mentioned, some of the rhetoric in 2016, the horrendous rhetoric of blaming the other, that blaming process is leading to anger. That anger is leading to hate, and that hate in some instances is leading to violence. This inciting of violence by labeling of the other is at the heart of this polarization problem in our country. And if we begin to address it, and the way we address it is by getting comfortable with the uncomfortable, the way we address it is actually starting from the very beginning of the labeling process. And when we begin to do that, and that's why I have the pledge to listen up here, when we begin to listen to each other, we then start to humanize. And that is not defending one's humanity. No one should defend their humanity. One's humanity should be respected. So there need to be terms that are agreed upon in order for us to be having these difficult conversations. And then once we do that and the humanization process starts, we have empathy. And when we begin to empathize, we move into exploring what our common values are. When we explore the common values, if there's enough there, we mutually commit to a shared future. That's where we restore agency. And then we get to a truth and reconciliation process. And that's what then leads us to sustainable peace. It's this process. And I just want to say this one thing. We are dealing with systemic problems. One-off conversations are not enough. We have to build a system that is going to actually replace the broken system that is oppressing people, that's not working for the majority of people. And we have to do it in a way that builds narrative that brings people in rather than pushes them out. I would just end on this to say, we ourselves need to be careful about not demonizing the other. I don't think of people as Trump voters or Biden voters or Clinton voters or this voters or that voters. Think of them as people. I think of them as my neighbors. They're my community. I care about them. And I've had enough experiences to know that in many ways they care about me too.
Thanks, Summer, for that. I think it's important to sort of point out here that this conversation isn't happening in the abstract around polarization, around bridge building, around reducing harm. You know, it's a matter of safety, and at times it's a matter of life and death for communities that are directly impacted by discrimination and violence. And so I think this conversation really brings up questions around allyship and the distinct roles that allies can play in this time. I mean, thinking about, and I want to ask you also about the role of people in marginalized or directly impacted communities as well. But thinking right now about the role of allies, what do you think allies should be doing right now in a practical sort of sense?
Samar, you want to go? Should I go?
I'll
go next.
We can bounce off of each other. We can bounce off of each other.
Yeah.
I mean, allies need to be doing a number of things. I think one is realizing, first off, it's always nice to come out and it's always nice to hear somebody say they care, right? And they support you. And there's a social media post that backs that up and et cetera. I think we have to really be a commitment. Being consistently committed and understanding that this is a long-term problem, which is going to require long-term solutions. And that means when you're the only person in a room and you see that don't wait for the person who's being targeted to defend themselves. And also recognize, and I've seen this a lot too, like when you do speak up, be careful of a savior mentality. So I think we need to move away from this kind of like savior mentality too, and think and really reframe this in terms of like allyship as a form of building community.
So Andrew in the Q&A has this question. I was just looking at it, which I'm going to just merge both. He goes, "I'm a privileged white man. I long and am willing to contribute financially to share in the rich stew of a freely diverse American culture rather than the pale sandwich ordered up by the legacy whites first crowd. What's the vehicle for my viewpoint? Thanks. Some of my favorite sandwiches are pale sandwiches, Andrew. They're very delicious. I think to combine, let me put it this way. I've said this to people, and this might be a little bit prescriptive, but I hope it's helpful. At the end of the day, we're only responsible for ourselves and our own intentions, right? I believe in God. I believe only God and you know what your intentions really are at the end of the day. And with all the problems, especially the ones outlined by Summer, it seems insurmountable because you could sit there and go, I'm not on a podcast, I'm not on a Zoom channel. I'm not the head of an organization like Catherine. I'm not the head of another organization like Summer. I'm not on CNN or New York Times like you, Wajahat. I'm just living in the suburbs. I'm a dad or I'm a mom. I got kids. What can I do? I'm so overwhelmed by climate change, racial injustice, income inequality, like potential fascism. I want to just tap out, right? And then this is why I tell people. I said, at the end of the day, we are responsible for our own actions, right? The footprint that you have on this earth and what you do with your time resonates. Example, just think about your family, the example that you might set in your household, right? Think about your kids. Think about the church you go to. Think about the school that you drop your kids off. Think about your small social circle. If you can change and you can bring in some more awareness, how that impacts growing outward, and then your kids have a new model and then they grow outward, like it literally has a ripple effect. And so what I would ask people to do is this, these three quick things is number one, awareness. Make a commitment towards awareness. There are things happening in this world. People are marching in the streets. Why are people marching in the streets? Why are people saying Black Lives Matter? What's this thing about white supremacy? I want to learn. Cultivate awareness. Awareness is not enough. Number two, you need to have intention. I would recommend making and declaring an intention. There's something really powerful about declaring the intent. Either vocalize it or write it down. I'm intending this year in 2021 for my New Year's resolution to be a better ally. And I will seek forth steps to be a better ally. But intention is never enough. And this is where we get stuck a lot of times in this conversation. But my intention was good, but I'm well-intended. I had a good intent. Action. The third part is action. What is your action following up on that intention, right? And that's where most people drop off. Everyone has a good intention, but what is your action? And the action that I would say for allyship is, number one, reach out, but reach out in a way which is respectful. And I'll tell you a quick example. Wajahat proved to me that Muslims are moderate. That is not good allyship. That is requiring me to do all of your work for you in a very offensive way. Instead, maybe be like, Waj, I have read this, I've heard this narrative for 20 years. Why am I hearing this? Can you point me to a resource? I know you're exhausted. If you're willing to have a conversation with me, I'd appreciate it. But I don't want you to do all the heavy lifting. What can I read? What can I see? What can I say? Like, what can I listen to? If you approach someone with that type of curiosity, like Samar was saying, it automatically changes the relationship. And more often than not, people go, thank you for reaching across the aisle. I'm so happy that you're willing to actually learn, right? The second thing I would do is this concept of privilege that we keep hearing about. We all have privileges: wealth, education, gender, race. I'll give you one example of something that I've been working on. Power blinds you. Power is blind to itself often, and it's also blind to its own oppression. I'll give you a quick example. I was used to 4 dudes being on a panel. Always. I just was. And then women, more and more in the last 5 years, like, hey, did you notice all the dudes? And I'm like, oh yeah, huh. I should have seen that. I didn't see it. Why didn't I see it? Thank you for telling me. Now I could have stopped it there. Instead, I had the awareness, I made the intent, I said, I'm gonna do a better job with the privileged spaces that I have to make sure I can flex the little bit of power that I have to make these spaces a little bit more equal and bring in more women or people of color, okay? Action. Then I'm in a position, I've done this, and it's not to pat myself on the back, I could do better, but now I'm like, okay, there's 3 dudes on this panel. Organizer, we can do better. Here's a name. Organizer, there's another person, right? Or sometimes like, I've spoken on enough panels, let me sit back. Let me sit back. And then the final thing I would say is make yourself uncomfortable and reach out to people that you otherwise would not reach out to, and offer yourself as a resource or offer yourself as a conversation partner, and be willing to sit with the discomfort. I really want to stress this. Be willing to sit with the discomfort. Toes will be stepped on. You will make mistakes. You will use the wrong pronoun. You will say something that someone says, how could you say that? They will say something that'll offend you. If you are committed to this in the long run, heroism and being the hero of the story is not being the protagonist of the story, not getting the accolades, not getting the spotlight. Heroism in this story is you having more awareness and doing your small part to help uplift other people, right? And it's a type of selfless role, which goes contrary to how we are, because we get defensive. I didn't mean to be racist or sexist. I didn't mean to say that. Oh my God. And then you tap out. You go, listen, man, I tried it. And then they just shit on me. And I don't want to take it. I would say just commit yourself to doing it and staying in the path. And then final thing I'll say, and Catherine has not asked me to say this, but there's a reason why me and Samar are here for shoulder to shoulder. They're putting in the work. They put in the work. They've built the alliances. They've had all the uncomfortable conversations. Catherine can tell you all the landmines that they have evaded and tripped over, and yet they still show up. And then you realize if the people who maintain that, they've become solidified around their shared values and their mission. And now in this age of polarization, you actually have some, I would take that back, a few organizations that have put in the work, that have the community, that have the resources, that have the best practices. Then I would say you join up and support those organizations and ask them for best practices and uplift them. I hope that helped.
I would just wanted to add one thing, and I know we have other questions, but I would say, and I put some things in the chat too, and that is the difference between individual engagement and allyship and communal and systemic. And so I think that we also need to be thinking about what does individual racism look like? What does an individual racist mean versus what does systemic racism mean? And what is being complicit and really, you know, enabling of a system that is racist? And how do you change those systems? And what's the individual role in that? What's the communal role in that? And that leads to those system shifts. And then that gets to power dynamics. And this is where people really get uncomfortable, is when we begin to talk about power and how we share power and what that means. And I think that that's at the heart of a lot of the conversation that we need to have right now. And what does power in 21st century America mean? What does power mean? What does sharing power mean when we are becoming a majority minority country? What does sharing power mean when how we're set up? And we have this system that has in the 2020 election has resulted in Trump winning 2,547 counties and Biden winning 509 counties. So Trump winning 81% of the counties across America, and we're structured as a republic. What does that mean for us? What does that mean for political power? What does that mean when the economic power rests with the minority of those counties? Let me say that, you know, like when the majority of our economic power is with, I want to say 15% of the counties across America, and that 70% of our country's population lives in less than 20% of our counties. What does this mean for us? And also the scarcity mentality, because I think we need to shift as well. There's a lot of shifting that needs to take place, and this thinking of, it's not that we don't have resources. We do have resources. It's what we're choosing to do with those resources. So I would say, yes, we need everybody to engage. We need people to ask questions. And also to be realistic about how much people can do, because everybody has day jobs, right? And so what can you do? What can you do in your place of work? What can you do in your place of worship? What can you do in your own community? And sometimes it's just simply also by saying, here are the norms that I want to, and asking the right questions to your elected official. Because you know what they say, you know, when the negative ads are going to stop is when they stop working.
Yeah. Yeah, we have a question in the Q&A that I want to pull up for you all that you've spoken to some, but Rima is asking. She says there's a rapidly increasing rural-urban divide, which I even sense between Samar and Waj. How do we address that? And she's saying this is purposely provocative, but do we need to issue passports for urbanites to travel to rural America and vice versa? What does it practically look like we can acknowledge that there's this rural urban divide, but what does it practically look like to do some work? Have you seen work that you think is helping in this arena? And I think this speaks to the county issue that you were just bringing up, Samar.
I think we can bounce off each other again. I think a large part is the narrative. I think like it's how we're getting information is these echo chambers. I mean, we're all being targeted by these algorithms as well. Somebody told me recently, you know, let's stop speaking in terms of vulnerable communities, instead start talking about targeted communities and people who are being targeted as well with particular messages. It's also the fact that broadband isn't working across the majority of these rural areas. I mean, it's just the fact that, again, going back to this whole whole conversation around power, and what does that look like in our 21st century? I mean, and also the fourth industrial revolution as it relates to jobs. And like, for example, rural America is still in a great recession. They haven't made it out of 2008. And also the truth and reconciliation processes that needed to happen after the Civil War and needed to happen again after the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s never took place. There are things that have not happened that we quickly need, and we can do it, but we first need to recognize that we need it, and we need to see each other's and recognize each other's common humanity. And that goes, I've lived in Washington, D.C. I lived in Washington, D.C. when I worked at a law firm, and then also when I worked as a White House fellow in President Obama's White House in the Obama administration. I mean, I was in those environments, lived overseas as well, spent an enormous amount of time in urban environments, and I didn't feel like I needed a passport. And I also didn't feel like I needed to ask somebody who had spent their entire life, like was growing up in an urban setting, if they needed, if they felt like they needed a passport to come to rural America. But I think what we do need to do is to stop the alienation. We need to stop alienating each other and also treating each other as if we are aliens, and like coming from another planet when we come to visit. And there are ways, again, to do that. There are ways to make, also, I can tell you, and I want to give Waj the floor here, but I can tell you that being a girl from a rural environment, growing up in a rural area, and folks and we say folks here, right? Like folks who are from these rural towns oftentimes will tell you the one thing that is always hard to shake off is that feeling of being inferior and insecure when you're in an urban environment. Going into the big city takes courage. And just recognizing that vulnerability that one's feeling is empathizing with them. It's humanizing them, and it's creating the space to connect. Yeah, rather than just sort of like constantly hitting, you're different, you're stupid, you're an idiot, you're poor, you're, all of these different labels that makes one kind of like just, close in rather than open up.
Yeah, and I think those labels are harmful also, because once you hear politicians say this, the real Americans, the heartland, right? That doesn't include us. And the rest of us are like, well, the majority of us actually live on the coast. Are we real? And real Americans becomes code word very quick for white American from the Midwest. Or the Rust Belt does not include the Black workers or the white workers, the Latino the women workers or the Latino workers in the Rust Belt, right? And so I don't need a passport to go to the Rust Belt. I've gone to the Rust Belt. I've gone to rural communities. I've had great food. I've had conversations with Trump supporters. We don't fight. We don't punch each other in the face. We had civil conversations, and we find shared values, and we talk about family. And there is a problem, though. The problem that is going to be a generational problem is disinformation. And politicians who realize that they can play upon these existing structural problems between the rural communities and quote unquote urban communities, the red-blue divide, the political divide. Secondly, the Southern strategy was specifically constructed to play against white rage and white lash when it came to the civil rights movement, right? The commonalities of the communities who live in the Rust Belt, or many people in the urban communities, it's shared. People want healthcare. People want Social Security. People want better education. People want better Wi-Fi. If you really think about it, like people kind of want the same things. But if you play specifically Black workers against white workers when it comes to race, it was a very successful strategy used predominantly by Republicans, constructed in the 50s, really kind of employed by Nixon, and then accelerated, voila, 2020, right? And so we have to look back and see what are some of the existing structural problems within America. And I hate saying this, but white supremacy. As long as we don't confront and dismantle white supremacy, this is going to be a problem. Disinformation, income inequality, right? Systems that oppress all of us. And I think if you step back, you really talk to most people like I have, what do they want? I'm like, man, I want a good job. I want a good future for my family. I want some savings. I want good education. I want good healthcare. And I feel like some of that work has to be done at a structural level. Actually, a lot of that work has been done on a structural level. The reason why I went to the individual for a second is I could see that we can sit here and just be like, oh my God, this is overwhelming. So we can, until structures catch up to where we need to be, I'm just saying as individuals, we have limited time, limited resources. We can do our part. And you, just one person reaching out, I'm telling you, you can change one person. I'll give you a last quick story, we're going to go through all these questions. I know. Ohio, I went to give a speech. Guy came to me afterwards, said, I never met a person of color until I went to college. I'm like, excuse me? I never met a person of color until I went to college. When I went to college and started talking to people of color, it blew my mind. And as a result of that friendship and relationship, I'm on a process. So I feel like I don't demonize that way, but some people do. You have to see everyone as human beings. And when I'm guilty of that, I step back. No one has horns on their head. We're people at the end of the day.
And, yeah, I mean, and that's the thing, people are on a process, and it's inviting people on that journey. And also I would just say another code, and I've gotten this a lot. It's like, because I remember asking, like, why are they demonizing me? Why do they hate me so much? And somebody said they don't trust your way of life. Realized, okay, so what is this way of life that you've been told is the American way of life versus the life I'm living? So what is that exactly? So what have you been told? And that gets this whole entrepreneurial politicians problem combined, and they're connected with the disinformation problem that's happening, which is leading to the criminalization, the politicization, and then criminalization in some instances of entire identities in the country. And this is incredibly problematic and dangerous. And I would just sort of say one of the ways in which we address this, and I want to read a stat to you for 1 second too. One of the ways we address this is, yes, on the individual level. The individual level is very important. Again, it builds to the communal level, and then that is also how systems shift and change. And that's also how entrepreneurial politicians have to react, because the norm setting of what works changes, and they want to get elected, so then they change. And then there are other ways to do that too, which through a functioning legal system like Brown versus Board of Education, change the norms in this country very quickly. But just to say, we need to build this ecosystem. So many people have mentioned, and in the chat and in this discussion already, there are a lot of great grassroots organizations that are doing this work. It's how we work together to shift from negative norms to positive norms. And to say, this is what will and will not be tolerated. We're not going to move, we're not going to keep moving the goalpost in the name of getting along to being in a place that is not civilized, that does not actually mirror what our core values and principles are in the 21st century. And then I just want to end on this note to say, according to Pew Research in 2016, a majority of highly politically engaged Republicans, 62%, and highly politically engaged Democrats, 70%, said the other party makes them feel afraid. That's fear. What does fear drive? Fear drives anger, hate, and violence. That's what it drives. We have to get at the core of that. But as Waj said, and he's absolutely right, if there's one thing you take away from this, focus on disinformation. It is at the heart of all of this. And if we're going to address the divide, we've got to figure out a solution to that. There are a lot of different tactics as to how we do that. Uncomfortable conversations is one of them. And it's a combination of things we're going to have to do.
Yeah. I want to pull in a couple questions from the room, and there's two that are sort of intertwined to each other that I want to lift up together. So one from Sohail is, if American Muslims don't do anything for the next 4 years, 8 years, 12 years to build bridges with other communities, what is the worst that can happen? I've been here since 1981 and seen a lot of good and bad, is what he says. And then the other question, sort of interrelated to this, is what if targeted or impacted communities don't do anything, stay safe, stick together, don't engage or build bridges? What if they're tired of listening to the privileged? What do you think about that? Where do allies fit into that sort of equation? And I want to give you both a chance to speak to that, but also just want to think about it from the perspective of shoulder to shoulder. I mean, we are primarily an organization that engages non-Muslim faith communities on coming alongside Muslim faith communities as communities and as individuals to fight against anti-Muslim discrimination toward a vision of America that it treats people of any faith or background with fairness, dignity, respect. And one of the things that we have been doing is through our Faith Over Fear trainings, really trying to equip primarily non-Muslim faith and community leaders to be actively engaged in this work in their own communities that sometimes have a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment without a lot of Muslims actually living there, and trying to help them sort of grapple with what does their role look like in that space to come alongside American Muslims in this. And I think, we talk a lot about shared values and calling in rather than necessarily calling out, calling people into something that we all can be part of. So just wanted to sort of put in that plug, but would love to ask you both to speak to these questions around the role of American Muslims, but also just impacted and targeted communities more broadly speaking.
Can I take a quick crack at it? And I know in the interest of time, I know I've been reading the Q&A, the questions and answers. I'm trying my best to incorporate them. So Sohail asked that question, and then Muhammad asked another question. And look, Samar made a point about that report I wrote called Fear Inc. Came out about almost a decade ago. It mentioned this infrastructure of hate mongers, the financial system, the think tanks, the community leaders, the religious right, the politicians, the media megaphones, right? Those people were seen as extreme fringe actors at that time who helped mainstream talking points such as Samar and others are part of the radical Muslim Brotherhood who have infiltrated the White House. President Obama is a Muslim. Sharia is a threat to America. No one knew what Sharia was at the time. It started literally right before the midterm 2010 elections. Why am I mentioning this? Fast forward to 2020, nearly every single person that I mentioned in that report that was once vomited out by the Republican Party by 2014 as being too extreme is now a mainstream player, is literally in the White House, is consulting Pompeo, Bolton, Miller, Bannon, Trump about Islam, Muslims, the Middle East, and national security. What was once considered fringe is now mainstream right-wing conservative talking points, which is why I don't do both sides here. There's not a both sides. Yes, yesterday, Donald Trump openly flouted imposing a military coup. That was 2 days ago, right? So this is what's happening, Sohail, is that we're dealing with a president who literally ran on the Muslim ban, who literally lied and said he saw Muslims celebrating the destruction of 9/11, who openly flirted with the idea of a Muslim registry. We've seen hate crimes, especially in Tennessee. Murfreesboro was like ground zero for this in 2010, 2011. They literally came together as a team, landed in Murfreesboro, and tried to have that community that's been there for 20 years to stop expanding their mosque. And they said Islam is not a religion, is a preeminent totalitarian ideology. So many Muslims will say, I'm not going to engage with Jews. I'm not going to engage with evangelical Christians. I'm not going to engage with anyone. F the system. I say, okay, you can do that. But you're going to be culturally, politically, socially irrelevant in the United States of America. You're not going to integrate in the way you want to integrate, and you will be further demonized. And not only will you be further demonized, there are forces at play literally right now who want to oppress you and your children. So you can sit out and be apathetic and cynical and yell boo from the cheap seats. But if that happens for 8, 10, 12 years, look what happened in 4 years of Trump. And so some of us, and I say some of us because everyone has a different role to play. Some people have a role to play in community organizations. Some people run for office. Some people get in the media. Some people do the social media activism. But if you are not willing to engage, then how can you be part and parcel of America, right? I'm talking about integration, not assimilation. And the final thing I'll say, in the interest of time, I want to switch it over to Samar to talk about this and the other question, is it is hypocritical for American Muslims to complain about Islamophobia but then crap on Mexican immigrants,
Right.
but then crap on LGBTQ, to then crap on Black people, but then say, come support me in Islamophobia. And I'm like, you have shoulder to shoulder, you have Jews coming out, but you're not willing to listen to them? Isn't that hypocritical? Isn't that like you being a monophic? Like, why would anyone take you seriously? I'm not saying you agree. And this is where it comes to the uncomfortable conversation. I'm not a kumbaya person. Let me even be more blunt. You could say, I'm against gay marriage. I think it's haram. But they have a right to the American dream, and they have a right to their rights. And I have a right to worship my community, and I'll stand up for them. They could stand up for me because they came out to protest the Muslim ban. I'm going to stand up for my Black brothers and sisters. I'm going to stand up for the Jewish community. I'm going to stand up for the evangelical community, right? And this is how we build that multicultural of the coalition of the willing in a meaningful way. And if we don't do that, not only will we be irrelevant, we will be oppressed.
Waj, you know what it sounds like? It sounds like you're talking about bridge building. It sounds like you're talking about building rather than burning. And go back to the title of this lecture. And I know it's at the heart of who you are. And also, I just want to say it's about transcending, right? It's about building those bridges and then transcending those divides around and common values and principles. And going back to that whole note is like, when you know what your values are, when you know what your principles are, it makes it, you know that if I'm going to stand for this, then I'm going to stand for that. And I'm not going to be hypocritical. And because this is who I am. And you're very clear on that. And you stand firm in that and unapologetically. And I just wanted to say, because I know we're coming on the hour here, we need to stop identity policing. Please, we really need to, people's identities are complex. And it is at the heart of who we are. It's at the heart of belonging too. And that is what a human being is trying to do, is to find that belonging. And so allow people the space to do that without constantly being up in their business about policing whether or not they actually are enough of this. Let them be. And that's the beauty actually of diversity. And I would just sort of say, really thinking about how are we defining, we're talking a lot about unity in this country. We're talking a lot about what do we do about polarization. We need to make sure that everyone is a part of defining what unity means. Okay, in terms of what is the way of life, what is the American way of life in the 21st century? What does that mean, and who is answering that question? We have to build consensus to answer it in a way that represents our values and our principles. And then I would just lastly say to Mohammed's point too, yes, there are people who are bullies, but I don't think the majority of people are bullies. And I think that the internet can encourage that. The cyberbullying is a serious issue. But I think in many ways, if you can create a shared vision for a future where people see themselves in it, they're incentivized to get it together. They're incentivized to make this shift in demographics work, but not without a truth and reconciliation process. We cannot erase our past. We can't pretend it doesn't exist. We have to deal with it. We have to make sure it's clear that we've learned from it, and that we're taking the best practices forward that makes sense for us to take forward, and we're dealing with the baggage in as healthiest a way as possible, so that we can actually move forward honestly.
Catherine, I know we're out of time. If I can get 10 seconds, if you don't mind.
Let me within your 10 seconds, I wanted to ask you both in less than 3 sentences to speak to the question of what does a shared vision of our future look like. So take your 10 seconds, Waj, and then roll that into it as well.
Sure. Mohammed's question, I don't know if you guys could see in the chat, is, how would speakers address the following? I often see conservatives or Trump supporters simply wanting to own the libs. It seems like the only motivation for this is to simply bully and be obstinate. How would you approach and dismantle the mindset? And it goes back to the original point, those are some of the folks I'm saying you won't win. And it's okay. We're not here to win everyone. And those are some of the people who I wrote the article for. I said I tried my best and I didn't win them. But there is a majority out there that Summer was saying. And so for me, it's how do I build a multicultural coalition of the willing? And the way I say it is 3 sentences or less is I imagine a movable table, a spread. And I envision my children having a seat at the table and bringing the biryani next to the meatloaf and the apple pie. And once they have that seat at the table, their job isn't finished. The vision for the America that I have is they'll look over their shoulder and they see who still needs a seat at the table and they'll extend their hand and bring them to the table as well. And the table keeps expanding. And that's the vision that I have.
Thanks. Summer.
Catherine, could you repeat that question?
The question was, in less than 3 sentences, for the sake of time, what does a shared vision for our future look like for you? Looking towards the positive.
Yeah, looking towards the positive, it is, honestly, it's a future that doesn't include racism. It's a future that has a system that is not oppressing people and is creating a vision of where people see themselves in a productive way, building productively together, and where they can be their whole selves.
Right.
And that they can embrace principles that don't harm their neighbors, that rather help them. We don't have to agree on everything. We won't agree on everything. It's crazy to think that we would and that we will. And Wash is right as well. We're not going to get everybody. And we can't, and there are people who are inherently going to be on the fringe, okay? But that's not who we are talking to. It's people who are, and I think that this is the majority of people who want a healthier tomorrow. They want a pathway for what that looks like. And I would just say this, one quick thing on that too, and I put this in the chat box. One of the ways we're going to deal with this information, or people who don't want us to come together in a healthy way, is by creating these videos and narratives that reinforce our humanity and those common values. Like hard work, for example, is one of them. Building community, helping your neighbor. Like Tennessee, for example, just very quickly, 2020, we had a tornado. Right after the tornado, we shut down because of COVID-19. Okay, we've had a really hard year here. But one of the things that everybody can agree on is, if we're in this together.
Yeah. Well, in many ways,
shoulder to shoulder, support shoulder to shoulder.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think that in many ways, so much of this conversation goes to how hyper local so much of this work of building community, building resilience, building the country that we want to see really is from the grassroots level. It's in local spaces that we're really doing that work to build communities. And so we're grateful
for access to opportunities so that individuals can realize their potential.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I feel like we could go on and on in this conversation. We could talk for hours, but just want to be respectful of everyone's time, and Summer and Waj for taking the time out of your day to join us for this conversation. Thank you. Thank you for this. Baby Yoda.
Be like Baby Yoda.
Joined us as well. I love it. Thank you all so much for taking part in this.
Peace in the United States.
Take care, guys. Thank you, everyone. Happy holidays to everyone.
Happy holidays.
Yeah, happy holidays.
Yes.
Thank you, shoulder to shoulder.